Good evening, Agile acquisition enthusiasts, and welcome back to the Underground Digital Tiki Bar. It's Friday night, and that means it's time for another episode of Agile Acquisitions Alcohol. Cheers. Notice the brand. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to my awesome and supportive wife who hooked me up with this. It's a little canister here. I'm gonna look inside. Little container for my glass, for my coaster, my little ice rocks. Super cool, and inspired me to get back to making videos. And we're kind of going back to the beginning here. So I apologize that I've been absent for a while, but we're back and I'm going to drop some knowledge on you. And on tonight's episode, we're going to talk about selling software to the DoD, the challenges that are there for companies that are trying to get into this space. And so let's go ahead and get started. I believe there's 5 challenges that companies face trying to sell software to the DoD. And the first one is intellectual property. So intellectual property is an interesting conversation. I've made other videos about it, but really it comes down to the government thinks of intellectual property as 2 sort of paradigms. One is COTS or commercial off-the-shelf software. And that's pretty easy because commercial software is very clear. They have end user license agreements or EULAs that establish the intellectual property and ownership of the rights. And there's not a lot of question that goes into that. It's covered under FAR Part 12. And then way on the other side, we have what's called GOTS or government off-the-shelf software, or more appropriately, custom government software. And part of the digital service movement of Agile development services, we really push the government to obtain ownership of the software that they invested taxpayer dollars into to acquire. And I absolutely still to this day support that. If the government and the taxpayers are going to pay for code to be written, then they should own that and be able to use that in other situations as appropriate for use across the government as widely as possible. But in between, there's this middle space. And as the government is trying to attract venture capital funded companies or new startups, non-traditional companies that are investing their own R&D dollars, or internal research and development dollars into building software capabilities, it's my impression that the government is struggling exactly with how to understand what rights to assert. And so I believe that, in this situation where the company is investing their dollars, they should own the rights to their intellectual property. Otherwise, what incentive would venture capitals or even companies themselves have to invest their dollars into building technology and capabilities? What makes this a little bit of a gray or confusing area is a lot of times this technology is very early. So they're building alongside with the customer. So it looks a lot like the Agile development services, which obviously I'm a big fan of. But the difference is the government isn't paying for hours or isn't paying for the iterations or software development itself. They're paying for configuration, implementation, and deployment of that capability. So in those situations, it's my feeling that the government should really be pushing for government purpose rights around the integrations or most importantly, their data. The government should always own their data in any situation where a contractor is telling them otherwise, I don't believe is appropriate. The second area of challenges for companies that are trying to get into software delivery or software solutions for the Department of Defense, federal government at large, is around what I call the valley of death. And that's where there's a lot of initiatives to get creative ideas into the government. The SBIR, or the Small Business Innovative Research Program, is a great example of that. There's funding provided and there's programs that make it, I don't want to say easy, but easier for non-traditional companies to get involved with the government and deliver kind of ideas or initial capabilities around technology. And then way on the other side, you have programs of record or established programs with lines of funding that come down that are planned for. But in between the two, getting an idea from research and development or innovation over to the area of operational deployment, there's a big valley of funding. And part of the reason of that is our appropriation system in our government that requires planning. You have to know ahead of time what you're going to fund, and you have to plan for it and put it in. It has to get approved and flow down. And that takes a lot of time. And that doesn't necessarily align with the innovation process. So you could be in the SBIR program, for example. If you work through the SBIR phase 1 or phase 2 program, you're looking at maybe 2 years of funding. But it's only until maybe the latter half of that process where the government realizes, yeah, this is a capability that we really want to invest in, that they actually understand what it is you're delivering. And at that point, it's too late to get into the budget cycle to get funding at the point at which that program ends to move to that SBIR phase 3, where it has to be funded by funds outside of the SBIR program. The third is around security. Obviously, with everything going on in the world, security is incredibly important. But a facility clearance, FCL process can take a lot of time for companies to work themselves through. And the paradox is you can't actually start the FCL process until you have a contract that requires an FCL process at DoD. Is through the DD 254. And you don't actually get issued a DD 254 until you've won a contract that has a security requirement. And then you can't actually deliver on that security requirement until you've been adjudicated through the FCL process through DCSA. And that can actually take several months, like I said, to several years, depending on the company's situation. And that puts companies in a precarious situation that makes it very difficult to have innovative ideas, especially for non-traditionally structured companies that might be more complicated than a company that was designed or established initially, specifically and entirely for DoD work. The fourth is around data. You've heard a lot, you've probably seen a lot in the requirements around AI. That's a big buzzword and a lot of requirements these days. But in order for AI or machine learning to be effective, you have to have access to data. Again, another paradox. The DoD sits on mountains of data. The defense travel system has billions of dollars worth of data, of travel, of users. All of that stuff is necessary for building machine learning and AI capabilities to train algorithms. But that data isn't accessible to companies that are trying to build software and then deliver. You have to first, again, get a contract with the government to get access to that data in order to begin selling or building your algorithms and training your algorithms. This makes it very complicated. In my opinion, there's a subset of that data which isn't classified, which doesn't need to be secured, that can be made available for companies to access and begin developing and training their algorithms so that when they show up on day one, they have data that is ready, machine trained, and able to provide value to the Department of Defense on day one. We miss that gap, and we end up injecting a lot of time from convincing the government to buy an idea, essentially, and then first getting access to the data and then training that data and actually deploying a capability. So the government needs to learn how to make accessible pots of data that are not sensitive to the government's national or to our country's national security, but that actually can precede that and then be built upon to develop capabilities. And then once you're in and you can have access to the more classified or more sensitive data, you can build upon that, but the initial capabilities and frameworks will already be there. And finally, education. So this is an example of education, right? But there's also a larger picture education, the DITAP, or the Digital IT Acquisition Professional Program, that was created out of the U.S. Digital Service, that I'm honored to have participated in the establishment of that and continue to provide training through those programs. It does help teach contracting officers how to buy this and understand these concepts, but writ large, there's not training across the board for contracting officers. I know I went through all of the Con 100, 300 level classes, and I never learned any of this stuff. It wasn't until I was in the real world application that I really got a good understanding of the importance of all of these topics that we've discussed tonight. And so investing in education and training contracting officers from the very beginning, especially those that are going to be involved in IT acquisitions, how to deal with these very difficult situations and be creative and work around them in order to get the government what they need to be successful. In these difficult times, it's so important that our government is as efficient as possible in getting new technologies and new software into the ecosystem so that we can be as effective as possible. So there you have it. Those are 5 challenges that the DoD and quite honestly, the federal government at large faces with implementing software solutions, or challenges that software companies face in selling to the DoD. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope that this was helpful. If you did, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and submit comments. If you have questions, you want to talk about this more, I'm happy to make future videos on it. And until next week, cheers.